All right, y'all. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Today we are going to talk salt. And more specifically, we're going to talk about the salt fix. This book was popular several years ago when it came out because, once again, it is more evidence, or I shouldn't say evidence. It's more arguments that some of the traditional health and wellness beliefs that we hear and kind of perpetuated in both pop culture and in medical kind of encounters with your doctor are maybe not as black and white or clear cut as we have. We've already talked about how the relationship between blood cholesterol and cholesterol that you eat is largely much more complex than that. And it's a similar situation with salt. For the longest time, salt has been this boogeyman as a means to reduce blood pressure and reduce your event of adverse cardiac events. So a lot of people have been trying intentionally to restrict salt in their diet. And what we do know is that's likely had an adverse outcome in some of those people. So once again, everything in medicine is risk-benefit ratio as it applies to your personal physiology, your body, what's going on in your life, and your beliefs. But I think that this book just does a good job of kind of laying out some of the evidence and some of the historical trajectory of how we came up with this idea that salt was unhealthy, when for the most part humans have been consuming salt, and not just consuming salt, but seeking salt out for thousands of years. So let's get right into it. One of the biggest themes in this book is just the idea that, just like a lot of other things in medicine, there's this snowball effect that once there's one study out that may over time show a declining effect, which we know happens in medicine all the time, it's really, really hard to undo that recommendation. So as that applies to salt, the author does a great job of highlighting some of the early trials in this country specifically that once we started trying to investigate what caused cardiovascular disease, they started looking at blood pressure, and when they started looking at blood pressure, they started looking at salt. And once the first couple trials come out showing that there may be some benefit in a low-salt diet, everybody latches onto that. The doctors latch onto it, just like things now get latched onto in the news, and we all start to now do this and become this. And as the evidence rolls out over the years to the contrary, it's really hard to forget or undo what we may have heard a long time ago. So one of the things that they highlight is some of the early evidence and early studies did show that salt was harmful, but then when they began to expand that and look at the trends within certain populations, there was actually a larger correlation between low potassium intake and high carbohydrate intake. And this is a major point about blood pressure. We think that maybe only 20 to 25% of the population is salt sensitive. And what that means is that if you consume a large amount of salt, your blood pressure is going to respond. The rest of those folks likely have very little, if at all, response to high sodium in the diet. And one thing that the author here notes is that if you look further into why is that 20 to 25% salt sensitive, what they're really looking at there is the major common denominator is insulin. So we talk a lot here at this practice about insulin. We all kind of know about diabetes. We have somebody in the family with diabetes. Maybe you know somebody that takes insulin shots, but insulin is a hormone, and it's not just about eating and sugar, but it has other effects. So as a response to high blood sugar consistently, your body produces more insulin, or you take insulin through a shot. And what that does is lower your blood sugar, but it also has other effects, mainly in the kidney. Insulin acts in the kidney to resorb salt and hold on to salt, which then brings water with it. So for those folks that are salt sensitive, one of the major underlying factors there that may be contributing to why they're so responsive to salt, raising their blood pressure, is that they have problems underlying with their metabolism, excess sugar in the diet, and insulin resistance, even if they don't have a diagnosis of frank diabetes. And that was consistently one of the main points in the salt fix, is that it's really, really hard to separate those two when we're looking at studies or looking at this country, as the rates of carbohydrate intake in the diet has increased over the same amount of time that processed and packaged foods that also have high sodium in them. They run together, so it's been hard to discern. But what we do know is they go back and look at some of those early studies. The effect of salt on blood pressure is not as profound, maybe 1 or 2 points in most people who are not salt sensitive. And there's a much larger correlation with people that consume more potassium in their diet have better blood pressures, and people who eat low potassium diets have higher blood pressures. And what that really comes down to is things that are high in potassium, fruits and vegetables, which we all know to be healthy, and things that are low in potassium are all of these processed prepackaged foods that also contain a bunch of salt. So I think no matter what the spectrum is, we can all agree that prepackaged foods that are low in potassium and high in salt are not good for your blood pressure. One common misconception that we talk about all the time is this idea of the DASH diet. Some of you may have heard about the DASH diet. It is our number one recommended diet, the diet against hypertension. And it sounds like a salt thing. They maybe didn't do us a favor by calling it the DASH diet, because everybody then makes this association with salt. But the DASH diet is actually a potassium-rich diet. What they did was they gave people potassium-rich foods, and that is the DASH diet as a means to lower blood pressure. It's not a low-salt diet. And I think that that's important to know. Once again, it's this idea that we're having to undo years and years of popular opinion and conception that salt is the main driver of blood pressure, when it may not be the case. One of the things that may support or deny that, and we sometimes don't like to look at things that are not broadly applicable to the population or things that more align with our lives, but one of the kind of interesting anecdotes, and we see this in other things, it's called when we're talking about dietary fats, increased saturated fats of the diet, high cholesterol foods, we talk about the French paradox. The French, and this has been refuted, but at some point it's been discussed about how the French have such low rates of heart disease and coronary disease and death from heart disease in their country, despite eating a diet rich in carbohydrate, full-fat butter, and steak tartare. And there's a similar correlation when we talk about salt. And specifically in the salt fix, they were talking about Japan, Korea, and France have some of the highest rates of salt intake in the world. Japan consistently, like on average over the population, I think I'd seen one study is like 4 or 5 grams a day of salt they eat. When in comparison to America, our standard recommended allowance of sodium is gone back and forth between 2,500 and 2,700 milligrams. And many people are eating much less than that if they're trying to restrict salt for health reasons. And what we found in those countries is that they have extraordinarily low rates of coronary disease despite all of this high blood pressure, even high blood pressure problem. They have low rates of coronary death and long-standing coronary disease as a population despite taking in that much sodium. And one explanation for this is, and this comes down to kind of the mechanism of the kidney when we talk about blood pressure, your body does not have a blood pressure sensor. There's nowhere in the body that says, I have high or low blood pressure. What you do have is a salt sensor. There's this spot on the kidney that when salt passes through it, it says, I have a high or low blood pressure. It has no idea what your blood pressure is. So the idea is if you present enough salt to that sensor in the kidney, your body thinks that I have a high enough blood pressure to continue living. But what happens is if you restrict salt, the filtrate that passes through the kidney, and there's no salt in it, what your body then starts to do is say, oh my gosh, I must have low blood pressure. And then initiates a cascade of hormone responses called the renin-aldosterone system, the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, which then causes your hormones to raise your blood pressure. So what we do know is that if you're consistently presenting low salt to that sensor in the kidney, it does have the ability to then initiate a cascade of hormones that makes you raise your blood pressure, hang on to salt, hang on to fluid, which could be totally detrimental to your health long term, or if you have certain health problems. And there's even some signal now in the heart failure literature. A couple years ago, there's a popular study about giving patients admitted in the hospital heart failure, giving them IV fluid with extra salt in it as a means to now counteract that balance of hormone. So I just think for the longest time, we've tried to put off or ignore how giving a low-salt diet could be harmful. It's not like, okay, well, it could hurt me if I eat too much salt, and what's the harm in me not getting enough salt? I might as well not salt my food, not keep any salt in the house. And that likely, at least in some people, is going to have a negative effect. And what we do know is that aside from the hormones that we just talked about, the renin and angiotensin aldosterone system, even if that's not going to get activated, we know that some people, especially depending on medications they take or depending on how many birthdays they had, start to get low in salt. And you need salt to maintain all of these levels in your body, to maintain cognitive function, nerve function. People get leg cramps when they're salt deficient, all types of things. So even from a blood pressure standpoint aside, you want to probably make sure you get enough salt. And the question is, a couple studies say that people are trying to restrict salt, may get 600 to 1,000 milligrams. It's recommended in this country to get, 2.5 grams, 2,700 milligrams. And part of what they discuss in the salt fix is that most people should probably be shooting for 3 to 4. And depending on activity level or things like that, maybe shooting for 4 to 5. So that's the salt fix. So in summary, a lot of us have been told that salt is bad. It's probably not that bad. We do know that if you restrict salt, it can actually raise your hormonal response to increase your blood pressure. And we know that you need salt to do lots of other things.